The screen did not flicker or fade, it simply died. One moment, the system dashboard for Novacore Solutions was displaying green telemetry across 48 industrial nodes, and the next, it was a blank expanse of charcoal gray. At the center of the display was a single line of text in a small, polite font. License authorization has expired. Please contact Ironclad Modular Systems to renew access. I sat at my kitchen table, taking a slow sip of black coffee, watching the system logs scroll by on my secondary monitor. In the quiet of the morning, the hum of my laptop was the only sound. For 4 years, my life had been measured in sprints, deployments, and midnight alerts. I had spent 12-hour days duct-taping databases and writing clean, modular orchestration code, while executives in tailored suits debated synergy and market penetration in air-conditioned boardrooms. My name is Jonathan Aldridge. I am 54 years old, and I have spent 32 years in software engineering. I have seen companies rise on the backs of silent developer and fall, because some manager thought a spreadsheet could replace a compiler. When I was hired at Novacore Solutions, they promised autonomy. They told me I would have the freedom to build a platform that could optimize complex logistics networks using neural nets. And for a long time, they kept their promise, mostly because they did not understand what my team was doing well enough to interfere. We were a small group, 12 engineers who operated like a wolf pack. There was Preston, our build engineer, who could construct a continuous integration pipeline out of sheer willpower. Nisha, who parsed log files with the precision of a brain surgeon. Gary, our ex-Google developer, whose cynicism was only matched by his brilliant database optimization skills. We built the core platform from nothing. It was a modular engine that could ingest millions of telemetry points from industrial hardware, predict failures before they happened, and save our clients millions of dollars. If Novacore Solutions had a future, it was sitting in our private repositories. But corporate environments are like weather systems. They change without warning. The storm arrived in the form of Julian Thorne. Julian was a newly appointed vice president of operations, a man who wore sunglasses indoors during morning stand-up meetings and smelled of expensive cologne and desperation. He had a freshly printed Master of Business Administration and a belief that any software project could be managed with slide decks and team-building retreats. The first time he walked into our lab, he looked at our physical board and smirked. He did not shake hands. He established connection. Within 5 minutes, he had used the term low-hanging fruit 6 times. I knew he was trouble. He looked at Preston and asked why we were still using physical cards when there were modern management platforms available. Preston did not look up from his terminal. He just muttered that physical cards did not have downtime. Julian did not like that. He turned to me and said he wanted to streamline our workflow. He wanted to unlock our full engineering potential by breaking down our dependency chains. In corporate speak, that meant he wanted to get rid of my oversight and manage the developers directly. He brought in his old college friend Oliver Fletcher to facilitate this transition. Oliver had no background in software development. His primary qualification was that he had managed a chain of frozen yogurt stores that had gone viral on a social media platform. Julian believed that managing young employees scooping yogurt was the same as directing senior engineers building industrial automation software. It was a laughable assumption, but in the corporate world, bad ideas often travel faster than sound. I tried to brief Julian on the system architecture. I pulled up the system diagrams, explained the modular design, and showed him how our internal microservices communicated. His eyes glazed over within 3 slides. He waved his hand and told me that he was a big-picture leader who did not get bogged down in the weeds. I told him those were load balancers, database clusters, and API endpoints that kept our clients online. He just smiled, a thin, patronizing expression, and told me not to worry. He said they were going to implement a decentralized management structure where the developers would self-organize under Oliver's facilitation. I realized then that my tenure at Novacore Solutions was reaching its end. Julian did not want technical leadership. He wanted compliance. He wanted a project he could claim as his own, and my presence was an obstacle to that goal. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten him or send angry messages. I simply walked back to my desk and began preparing. I had been in this industry long enough to know that when a manager starts talking about streamlining and decentralized leadership, it is time to build a firewall. Not a technical firewall, but a legal one. I knew that the company had been struggling financially during the previous fiscal year, and the development budget had been slashed by 45%. That was when I had structured our work through an external entity to ensure continuity. The team members were technically contracted through my private entity, Ironclad Modular Systems. This arrangement allowed us to keep the project alive when Nova Core Solutions could not pay them directly. The legal agreements, drafted by my attorney Alina and approved by the company's internal counsel, clearly stated that the software modules remained the property of my entity until a final integration contract was signed. The license to use them was conditional upon my active technical oversight. If my involvement was terminated, the license would automatically revoke itself. It was a standard safety clause, one that Julian completely ignored because he did not read the integration documents. He believed that everything we built belonged to NovaCore by default. He did not know that the system was running on borrowed time and that the keys were in my pocket by the second week of Julian's tenure. The atmosphere in our lab had shifted from focused collaboration to quiet frustration. Oliver Fletcher had set up a large display screen in the corner of our workspace, where he projected colorful charts detailing team synergy, throughput velocity, and alignment metrics. He insisted on holding 3 stand-up meetings every day, which he called alignment touchpoints. During these meetings, he would stand at the front of the room, tossing a soft foam ball to senior engineers and asking them to share their emotional bandwidth. Gary, who had spent a decade building complex search algorithms, would stare at the foam ball as if it were a biohazard before passing it back without saying a word. Oliver did not notice the quiet resistance. He was too busy explaining how we could apply the logistics principles of frozen yogurt distribution to industrial software pipelines. He talked about flavor rotations and customer throughput as if they were directly equivalent to database transactions and load balancing algorithms. Preston sat in the back, his arms crossed, his face a mask of pure annoyance. Nisha took notes on her laptop, though I could see from the reflection in her glasses that she was actually writing a script to automate her responses. I watched this circus with a mixture of amusement and exhaustion. I spent most of my time acting as a shield, intercepting Julian's demands and translating Oliver's vague instructions into actionable technical tasks. I wanted to protect the platform. We were only 3 weeks away from our scheduled launch date, and we had a pilot deployment running with our largest prospective client, a logistics conglomerate called Atlas Core. The Atlas Core contract was valued at $19 million, a figure that Julian had been using in his internal slide decks to justify his operational changes. He did not understand that the pilot was running on our staging server using the modular licenses owned by Ironclad Modular Systems. To him, the software was just a resource to be harvested, a box of code that we had already completed. He believed that since the code was written, the job was done, and we no longer needed expensive engineering leads to oversee it. The turning point arrived on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. I was reviewing the latest database migration logs when Julian's assistant sent me a calendar invite for a quick check-in. The meeting description was blank, and the location was Julian's corner office. When I walked in, I found Julian leaning back in his leather chair, holding a printed document, while Oliver stood by the window, looking out at the wet parking lot. Julian gestured for me to sit down, his face wearing that familiar, patronizing smirk. He folded his hands on the desk and leaned forward. He told me that they had been reviewing the operational structure of the engineering department and had decided to make a transition. He said that my leadership style, while effective in the early stages of development, was no longer aligned with the company's long-term trajectory. He explained that they wanted to empower the developers by removing the technical hierarchy and allowing them to self-organize under Oliver's facilitation. He spoke in a smooth, practiced corporate dialect, using words like evolution, alignment, and optimization. I sat in silence, letting him finish his speech. I asked him if he understood the technical complexity of the integration we were building, particularly the proprietary scheduling module that coordinated the industrial hardware. He chuckled, waving his hand, and said that all software was just Python code and database connections, and that his engineers could handle it. He told me that my role was being eliminated as part of a restructuring effort to reduce management friction. He said it was not personal, just business efficiency. I did not raise my voice or argue. I asked him about the transition period and who would manage the platform licenses and contractor agreements. He dismissed the question, stating that all intellectual property belonged to NovaCore Solutions and that they had the keys. I stood up, closed my notepad, and walked out. I went back to the lab and looked at my team. They were working quietly, unaware that the corporate guillotine had just fallen. I knew that they were loyal, not to NovaCore, but to the project and to the environment we had built together. I decided not to tell them yet. I wanted the corporate transition to happen on Julian's terms, so that the consequences would be entirely his own. I spent the rest of the day cleaning my local workspace, ensuring that all my personal documents and repository keys were securely stored on my encrypted drive. I did not delete any code or sabotage any systems. That would have been illegal and unprofessional. I simply prepared to step away, knowing that without my active oversight, the modular licenses would expire in exactly 5 days. The countdown had begun, and Julian was too busy celebrating his restructuring to notice the ticking clock. I walked out of the building that evening into the cool autumn rain, feeling a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in years, I did not have to worry about the next sprint or the next executive presentation. The weight of NovaCore's $19 million future was no longer on my shoulders. It was on Julian's, and he had no idea how heavy it was. It happened on a Monday morning. The air in the main war room was thick with the smell of stale coffee and cheap supermarket bagels that Julian had brought as a peace offering. The 12 engineers of my team filed in, clutching their laptops and looking confused. They had been summoned to an emergency alignment meeting at 9 o'clock sharp, an hour when Julian was usually still in his car. I stood near the whiteboards, my backpack already slung over one shoulder, holding my mug. Julian clapped his hands to gather everyone's attention, wearing a bright, enthusiastic smile that did not reach his eyes. He stood next to Oliver, who was holding a clipboard and looking eager. Julian cleared his throat and announced that they were entering a new phase of growth and optimization. He said that to streamline operations and reduce unnecessary management overhead, I would be stepping away from the project immediately. He told the team that they were ready to fly solo, and that Oliver would be facilitating their daily stand-ups and workflow coordination. He spoke with a disturbing cheerfulness, as if he were announcing a company holiday rather than the dismissal of their technical lead. The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody moved, nobody reached for a bagel. Preston stopped typing and stared at Julian. Nisha looked at me, her eyes wide with shock. Julian continued to smile, waiting for someone to thank him for the bagels or ask a question about the new Agile structure. When the realization set in, the reaction was immediate. Preston did not say a word. He simply closed his laptop, wrapped his charger cord around his hand, stood up, and walked toward the door. When Julian asked him where he was going, Preston did not look back. He just said that he was going to find a place where developers were treated like professionals rather than lines on a spreadsheet. Nisha stood up next, placing her notebook in her bag. She told Julian that she had an alignment meeting with a clean codebase and could not waste time on synergy touchpoints. Then Gary stood, muttering something about finding a place where technical competence was respected. One by one, like dominoes, the developers stood up and walked out of the room. Tobias, Grant, Megan, Aaron, Owen, and Fiona from Quality Assurance all joined the silent exodus. Oliver stood there awkwardly, his clipboard clutched to his chest, his mouth slightly open, looking at the tray of bagels as if hoping they would solve the problem. The last to leave was Toby, our intern. He stopped at the door, looked at Julian, and said that he hoped Oliver's frozen yogurt experience included a module for debugging memory leaks, because they were going to need it. Julian sputtered, calling after them about contract violations and unauthorized walkouts, but his voice sounded small and hollow in the emptying room. I followed my team out into the parking lot. The sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Preston was leaning against his car, waiting for me. I told them that they did not have to do this, that they had careers and stock options to consider. Preston shook his head and said they had joined the project to build something real with me, not to be managed by a frozen yogurt salesman. Gary laughed, lighting a cigarette, and said that he would rather write documentation for archaic database systems than spend another hour in Oliver's synergy meetings. Nisha agreed, saying that they knew who actually wrote the architecture and who was just trying to slide their name onto the final release. I felt a deep sense of pride. They did not know the details of my legal firewall yet, but they knew that we were a team. I told them to go home, relax, and wait for my call. I assured them that their contracts were secure. They did not realize that their agreements were with my Delaware entity, Ironclad Modular Systems, and that their employment was legally protected under our contractor structure. 6 months before this confrontation, I had seen the writing on the wall. The company had slashed our research and development budget by 45%. Instead of letting the project die, I had met with the company's internal counsel and proposed a contractor agreement. I had argued that by transferring development to an external entity, we could protect NovaCore from liability and ensure continuity. The council, exhausted by executive changes, had approved the arrangement. We signed a contract stating that the modular core remained the intellectual property of Ironclad Modular Systems and that the license to integrate it was conditional upon my active technical oversight. Julian had never read that contract. He had inherited the project and assumed that everything sat under his corporate umbrella. He did not know that by firing me he had pulled the trigger on a legal mechanism that would disable the core software modules in exactly 5 days. He believed that the engineers would return once they realized they needed their paychecks. He did not understand that their paychecks came from my entity and that NovaCore was merely a client. As I drove away from the office, I looked in my rearview mirror at the quiet building. I knew that the silence would not last long. Within a few days, the system would begin to alert, and Julian would realize that he had inherited an empty shell. He had the bagels, he had the conference room, and he had Oliver's clipboard. But he did not have the code, and he certainly did not have the people. He was left alone in a silent war room with 12 empty eaters and a tray of stale bagels. The first warning occurred at 11 o'clock on Wednesday morning. The internal staging environment for NovaCore's Smart Flow logistics system went offline. It was not a crash. The server simply refused to execute the core predictive engine. The monitoring dashboard displayed a clean white screen with a single notice stating that the license was invalid and that the administrator must be contacted. By noon, 3 different enterprise clients had reached out to their account managers, complaining that their testing sandboxes were non-responsive. The Atlas Core pilot, their $19 million prize, had gone completely dark. Julian's reaction was predictable. He launched into a panic, demanding that the DevOps team override the security controls and restart the servers. But the DevOps engineers could do nothing. They were getting the same license expiration message in their logs. The core modules were encrypted and ran under a runtime licensing manager that verified my digital signature. Julian did not understand that he was trying to run software without a valid license, which constituted willful copyright infringement under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106. I spent that afternoon sitting on my porch enjoying the quiet. My phone began to buzz with messages from my former team. Gary sent a message saying that Julian had tried to call him 4 times, offering a promotion if he came back to fix the environment. Preston sent a screenshot of a desperate email from Oliver, asking if he could provide the administrative password for the staging server. None of them replied. They knew that the system was running under the Ironclad agreement and that they had no legal authority to modify the production code without my authorization. By Thursday, the panic had reached the executive suite. Eleanor Higgins, the director of operations, called Julian into a meeting. She had been reviewing the Atlas Core integration documents and had found the licensing agreement. She asked Julian if he had read Clause 7.2.1, which stated that the license was automatically revoked if my technical oversight was terminated. Julian stammered, claiming that it was just a formality and that the company had full ownership of the intellectual property. He suggested that they could simply bypass the license check or copy the code. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. She pointed out that the contract was signed by the previous CEO and approved by internal counsel, and that it was legally binding. She told him that they were facing an operational disaster. She explained that the modules were signed with a hardware-bound key that sat in my private key store on an external device, and that bypassing it would require cracking a 2048-bit encryption key, which was technically impossible. Julian also tried to access our private cloud infrastructure. He spent 3 hours on the phone with the technical support team of our cloud provider, attempting to convince them that NovaCore had the right to access the cloud resources hosting our modular code. He raised his voice, threatened to cancel their contracts, and demanded that they reset the administrative access keys. But the cloud support representatives were unimpressed. They politely explained that the account was registered under the legal name of Ironclad Modular Systems LLC, and that they could not discuss the account or reset any credentials without a written request signed by the designated account administrator, which was me. Julian slammed the phone down in frustration, realizing that he had no way to access the live deployment pipeline. Every avenue he tried was blocked by a legal or technical barrier that he had previously dismissed as irrelevant weeds. Julian attempted to resolve the issue by drafting a retroactive assignment of intellectual property rights. He reached out to the junior developers who had remained at the company, offering them financial incentives to sign the document, which would transfer the rights of the modular system to NovaCore. But my attorney Alina intervened immediately. She sent a cease and desist letter to Julian and the board of directors, stating that any attempt to force employees to sign contracts under coercion was illegal, and that any such agreement would be void ab initio due to lack of corporate authority and duress. She also pointed out that under federal law, the unauthorized distribution of our proprietary code constituted direct copyright infringement under Title 17 of Section 106, and patent infringement under Title 35 of the United States Code, Section 271. The letter carried the threat of statutory damages of up to $150,000 per violation. The board of directors realized the gravity of the situation. They saw that Julian's actions had exposed the company to massive liability. Furthermore, they realized that they were in violation of the Federal Warning Act, which is Title 29 of the United States Code, Section 2101. By effectively laying off the entire engineering department, without 60 days advance written notice, they faced civil penalties of $500 per employee per day of violation, plus back pay. The $19 million Atlas Core contract was frozen, and the client had threatened to sue for breach of contract if the system was not restored by the end of the week. The corporate structure that Julian had tried to build was collapsing under the weight of his own arrogance. He had tried to play chess without knowing the rules, and now he was facing checkmate. He stood in the hallway, sweating through his shirt, shouting at his phone while developers walked past him in silence. The power had shifted, and he was finally beginning to realize that without the engineers and the licenses, he was just a man with an empty title and a tray of stale bagels. The climax arrived on Sunday evening. The board of directors had called an emergency session at our headquarters. I was invited along with my attorney Alina. When we walked into the main conference room, the atmosphere was tense. The board members sat in silence, looking at their tablets, while Julian Thorne sat in the corner, his head in his hands. Oliver Fletcher was nowhere to be seen. Eleanor Higgins sat at the head of the table, looking calm but determined. The chairman of the board opened the meeting by stating that they were seeking a resolution to the operational impasse. He said that NovaCore was facing catastrophic losses, with the $19 million Atlas Core contract on the verge of termination and 3 other clients threatening legal action for service disruptions. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I opened my folder and had Alina distribute copies of our reinstatement proposal. The terms were simple. First, my immediate reinstatement as the platform custodian and sole administrator of the licenses, with a contract that could not be revoked by operations without board approval. Second, the reinstatement of my entire team of 12 engineers, with their contracts transferred back to Ironclad Modular Systems. Third, a compensation adjustment that tripled our previous base salary, backdated to the day of my termination. Fourth, a public statement clarifying that my departure was due to a contractor restructuring, not a performance issue. And fifth, the immediate termination of Julian Thorne for breach of fiduciary duty. Julian stood up, his face red with anger, and began shouting. He claimed that I was extorting the company, that my LLC was a sham, and that the platform belonged to Novacore. The chairman raised his hand, silencing him. The chairman looked at Marissa, the head of legal, and asked for her opinion on the situation. Marissa closed her folder and stated that if they did not accept my terms, the company would face direct lawsuits for copyright infringement under Title 17, patent infringement under Title 35, and a federal class action suit for violation of the Warren Act under Title 29. She added that Julian's decision to terminate the administrator, without reviewing the integration contract, constituted a clear breach of his fiduciary duty, which exposed the company and him personally to significant shareholder derivative lawsuits for the dissipation of corporate assets. She made it clear that the company had no legal defense against these claims. The chairman turned to Julian and told him that his services were no longer required. He said that Julian had managed to destroy $19 million in value in less than 3 weeks, which was a performance metric they could not ignore. He ordered security to escort him from the building. Julian looked around the room, searching for support, but none of the board members would meet his eye. He picked up his briefcase and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. After he left, the board voted unanimously to accept my terms. The agreement was signed, and I was given my new security badge. The next morning, I walked back into the lab. The display screen that Oliver had used for his synergy charts was blank, sitting in the corner like an abandoned television. Preston, Nisha, Gary, and the rest of the team were already at their desks, typing away as if they had never left. Toby was throwing the soft synergy ball into the trash can. Gary laughed, asking if we were going to have a morning stand-up to discuss our emotional bandwidth. I sat at my desk, plugged in my laptop, and initiated the license reactivation sequence. Within minutes, the staging servers turned green, and the telemetry dashboard showed that the industrial nodes were back online. The Atlas Core pilot was restored, and their executives were notified that the system was running. Preston sent a message to the team chat with an image of a padlock, and the others replied with thumbs-up emojis. Eleanor Higgins walked into the lab later that morning, holding a cup of coffee. She stopped by my desk, looked at the green dashboard, and nodded. She told me that the Atlas Core executives were satisfied and that the contract negotiations had resumed. She apologized for the disruption and admitted that leadership had failed to perform due diligence before implementing the changes. I told her that in engineering, we always build fail-safes into the system. The contract was just another fail-safe, a social engineering bug patch for executive error. She smiled, took a sip of her coffee, and walked back to her office. The rest of the day was filled with the familiar, comforting sounds of keyboard clicks and developers debating architecture. We had a platform to deploy, and for the first time in months, we had the autonomy to do it right. Toby came over to show me a script he had written to clean up the legacy codebase, and Preston was already planning the next continuous integration cycle. We had built a system that was resilient, not just against code failures, but against corporate greed. We had shown that in the world of technology, the people who build the platform will always hold the keys, and that no amount of corporate jargon can replace the quiet power of a team that stands together. As I watched the green lights on the dashboard scroll by, I knew we had won, not by fighting but by building a structure that could not be broken by those who did not understand it.